welcome to True Crime with me, Emma Kenny. Thanks for joining me. If you are new here, I release crime content on a Wednesday and a Sunday religiously every single week. If you haven't joined me for a live chat, why don't you? I premiere them so that we can all get involved and share our opinions about said crimes that I'm covering. Big shout out to all of you who comment, give me a like, subscribe. All of you make a massive difference to my life, and shout out to my Patreon followers as well. Thank you so much. More podcasts are getting released and more are in the pipeline as well, with lots of interesting people. So I appreciate all of your support. As you know, I am wearing my merch because Bang to Rights remains my favourite saying, but all of the others you've asked for, I digress, and so on and so forth, will be coming out shortly. Literally, you request things and we just do them because we really appreciate your feedback. The case I am going to cover today makes me very angry. Like a lot of you, crime is always going to be something that we feel an empathy towards victims for, because when people go through horrible things, whether it's the families of those who are left behind or whether it's the individual who suffered the crime themselves, the fallout can be catastrophic for people. Of course it can, and we feel a level of anger about the fact that individuals go through horrible circumstances and some lose their lives. But there is always one area that I struggle with, in spite of all the years that I have worked in this field, and that's child murder or child death per se. Firstly, it goes against the law of nature. The reality is that a parent should never bury a child. But secondly, when a child is killed by essentially the people that are meant to care for them, it's really triggering. I personally believe that when you are gifted a child, it is your job and duty for your entire life to be devoted to them. I appreciate other people have different opinions about when parenting comes to an end and when children should support themselves and so on and so forth. Personally, for me, it's until I take my last breath. And the one thing that I pray for more than anything when I go to bed every single night, the first thing I ask for is for God to protect my children, so that I will have an opportunity to see them grow and develop and thrive. And one day when I take my last breath at 312, because obviously I'm not going to die for a very long time, I will know that they have had a life fully lived with my support. And even though I'm leaving them, I will know I've done a good job. If I had to bury a child, I don't know how I would cope with that, and I don't think most of us would know how to, because that's what parents are and do. We love our children and we prevent them from having harm occur, and when things do go wrong, we provide them with the support required to move through it. So when I hear about parents or caregivers causing deaths of those children that were gifted to them, it makes me incandescent with rage. And I also have to check my behaviour, because the one I'm going to talk about today, I am going to sound at points judgmental on this, and I make no apologies for that, but I will try to remain in a professional context and not completely lose my mind when I describe my thoughts about the sentencing regarding this particular case. I'm going to be covering one that you've asked for, and I've left it a little while because obviously I have covered poor Arthur and Starr's cases in the past few months, and I'm always very aware that because this can be quite a triggering subject, that I leave some gaps in between other cases. Alfie Lamb's case is really, really sad and was so preventable. It happened on the 1st of February 2018. And the perpetrators of the crime were 22-year-old hairdresser Adrian Hoare, that was Alfie's mother, and her boyfriend, 24-year-old nightclub worker Stephen Waterson. They had been shopping for the day. They'd gone to Sutton to get some cushions. Interestingly, Waterson is actually the adopted son of former Conservative MP for Eastbourne, Nigel Waterson. A little bit of trivia for you there. I'm sure that Nigel isn't very proud of said child. Now, Hoare's young son Alfie was with them, as you would expect, because they'd been shopping and they were taking care of him. I put that in the loosest inverted commas when I discuss what care is. Alfie was 3 years old at this point, and he had a nickname, Little Tarzan. which I imagine would be about the fact that he was a classic rambunctious little boy who was always climbing on things and jumping on things and being rough and tumble, as children should all be. They were travelling with 3 other people at the time. That was 21-year-old Marcus Lamb. He was actually driving Waterson's Audi A4 convertible. 18-year-old Emily Williams and her young daughter. Marcus Lamb and Emily Williams were friends of Alfie's mother and boyfriend. However, it is worth noting that at this time, Lamb was actually disqualified from driving. He shouldn't have even been behind the wheels of a car. He later would go on to actually claim that the reason that he was driving was because he was being threatened by Waterson. And what you're going to note throughout this, Waterson has a penchant for threatening people. Waterson is an individual who would be known as a classic bully and is somebody who doesn't seem to learn consequential behaviour. So he is in a position that I believe throughout his life, bullying has served him effectively and efficiently. His psychological framework is one where he believes that if he wants something, bullying, intimidation and threats is the way forward. So just be aware of that when I start to talk about the crime per se, because I think that certain bullies are incredibly dangerous. And I sometimes feel that the word bully is almost overplayed to a position where we forget the malevolence that can be involved in that kind of behaviour. And if you think about bullying offline and online, as much as we can hear lots of people say the stereotypes, which is, oh, well, the bully will have been bullied themselves and so on and so forth. Actually, the evidence and the research doesn't tend to buck that belief. In fact, what the evidence suggests is that most bullies have an overinflated sense of self. They have a self-importance belief system, which is why they feel that what they think is how everybody should think, and what they want to do should be allowed to happen and play out because they want to do it. So as opposed to these bullies being victims, they tend to just be straight out perpetrators. Also worth noting that both online and offline, certain bullies have what's known as the dark triad of personality traits, and that is a really scary triad. So that's Machiavellianism, it's narcissism, and it's psychopathic behaviour. So you have that combo of really challenging traits, and then imagine walking around with those as a human being and the damage that you could do if they were unchallenged or didn't have consequences applied to them. So this is me setting up the kind of personality that I believe Waterson had. So they go shopping and then they return to Waterson's vehicle because they're going to go back to the flat in Croydon, South London, where Hoare lived with Waterson. And you can actually see that there is CCTV footage which shows Alfie running before getting to the car to kind of keep up with his mum while she had hold of his hand. I appreciate that a lot of people will say, well, this is kind of normal behaviour, mums are in a rush, and at the end of the day they pull their child along to hurry them up. I, in my entire life as a parent, never did that. At no point would I put my child in a position where they felt they couldn't keep up with me. I don't feel that that gives them a very good message. My job as a parent is to create a supportive environment that is compassionate. And if I need them to hurry up, I would not drag them. I would do it at a speed that they could manage, and I would be with them. There would be a parallel nature because I don't want them to feel dominated. And I have never pulled my child along by the hand because, again, I feel that's physical domination. I don't think that's helpful for the child, and I don't think I'm thinking of the needs of the child during those moments. And if I really needed to rush somewhere with a 3-year-old and I really needed to get somewhere fast, I would pick them up and I would carry them in a nurturing way, explaining why I was doing so. I know lots of parents have different ideas around this, but that personally is something that I note in somebody's behaviour. She's dragging him along by his hand and he's having to run to keep up, which can put the child in a state of distress. And Marcus Lamb actually validates some of these thoughts and feelings that I have, because he would later tell the court that when they had been out shopping, she had been treating Alfie really quite badly during that shopping trip. So he gave some examples. If Alfie tripped up, she would just drag him along. So again, That's completely unnecessary. What do we really want to do when a child trips up? Obviously, we don't want to indulge them. We're not going to be like, oh my God, you've had a terrible accident. What do we need to do? Do you need hospital attention? That's not what I'm saying. We all know that kids fall over. It's more about giving them a rub on the knee and saying, come on, let's get ourselves together and let's go forward and let's move on. And it's like not indulging them to a point where they get reinforced with just sitting there and crying and feeling helpless. But it's certainly a thing where we acknowledge what's happened and we make them feel noticed. Children need to feel noticed if they're going to feel loved and valued. But instead, she was just constantly dragging him along. When he fell, she would drag him further. And Lamb also reported that she kept screaming at him. And this is something that I find really challenging. And it's certainly when I've taught parents about better ways of responding and reacting to their children, I always say, stop shouting. There are lots of reasons why I say that. Firstly, shouting is intimidating and scary. Why would you want to do that to a child? Secondly, it means that the child doesn't hear. All they do is respond to fear. So they're not actually listening to what you're saying. They're just afraid of you. Not good parenting. And most importantly, it doesn't get to the root of the issue that the child is struggling. Children only have a certain amount of ways of communicating, and one of them is to cry or to feel frustrated and throw things and do all these things that might feel annoying. But there is reasoning behind them, and you have to teach them that you are listening. Otherwise, their volume and their actions will get bigger and bolder and more problematic as they get older, because they need to express something to you that you're not hearing. And basically, you are walking around as a 3-year-old in a land of giants. Adults around you are intimidating, and there is one thing you need. You need your parent to be a safe space. You need to know that when all comes to all, if something is difficult for you to comprehend or compute emotionally, your parent and primary caregiver will give you a space where you can do that. If you make that space unsafe, you aren't just affecting them developmentally, you aren't just teaching them that they're not going to be heard, you're actually teaching a really problematic lesson, which it is, there isn't somewhere safe for you in the world. And actually, for most kids, that's going to provoke a huge amount of anxiety, or it may even make them feel so helpless that they stop even asking for their needs to be met. We can avoid all of that when we treat our children with compassion and respect. I say this to people constantly because it's amazing how okay a lot of people are with hitting a child or screaming at a child. And again, I appreciate every parent has got a different value system around this, but let me tell you why. If you were to go into the office and your manager were to come over to you because you've done something wrong and scream at you in your face and then clout you across the face, might not be really hard, but in a way that made you feel completely reprimanded and stunned, you're going to go to HR and have them sacked, and rightfully so. Same as if you're in a relationship and your partner clouts you across the face and shouts at you, it's going to be domestic abuse, and rightfully so. Why do we not treat children in that way? And if you know and I know that there could be a potential for any harm to be translated in those actions to a child, shouldn't we do our best to prevent that actually occurring? Shouldn't we do our best to prevent an action that could cause harm? Doesn't mean you can't discipline your kids, doesn't mean you can't make it very clear to them that they have done something wrong. And yes, I am biased because my own boys have been brought up without any kind of physical assault or violence or hitting or smacking, and they certainly haven't spent their lives being shouted at, because it just doesn't work. And I've got very peaceful communicators because they've learned that that's all they need to do to make the world change in a way that's effective for them. I digress, but I'm just setting it up because this case has really triggered me in this way. One of the things that Waterson actually refused to allow the children who got in the car to do was to sit in seats. Now, on one level, that's obviously highly illegal. On another level, what does that say about value? You're not allowing kids to sit in the seats of the car, the most vulnerable passengers you will ever have, and he doesn't let them sit in the car, as far as physically in a seat. Instead, Alfie's basically put behind a space which is between the front passenger seat and the seat at his mother's feet. Yeah, so the footwell, basically, that's where he's put. Also, to add insult to injury about this, Lamb was driving an Audi. Now, that Audi was a particular sports car and it had 2 doors, which means anybody knows this if you've got a 2-door car. Fine in the front, you've got some space, haven't you? But it tends to be, particularly with sport models, that there's very little room in the back footwell anyway. It can be quite challenging to be a passenger in one of those cars if you're in the back seats, because they're not really made for family dynamics, are they? Now, Alfie didn't like this. and he was upset. And he wouldn't stop crying. And can we just reflect on what Alfie has been doing? He's been cushion collecting in a shopping centre where he's been dragged through the area, running along to try and keep up with his mother, being screamed at and tripping over. By the time he gets to the car, he's going to be absolutely knackered. Anybody who has tried to manage an irritable and shattered child knows how they respond and react. They get really teary. It's just the way kids are before they get to sleep, and what they require is lots of comfort or some distraction, like giving them something nice to eat. But clearly, parents struggle at the same time when a child is shouting or screaming out of control, because it can feel very triggering for them and it can be frustrating to hear, and that can create a cooking pot of possibility as far as reactions. But Alfie is now in a position, exhausted and very upset, shoved in the footwell. Also, turns out that when this is happening, the way his mum responds is to slap him around the head and tell him to shut up. Apparently she was angry because Alfie was being too noisy. How dare the 3-year-old child who's knackered and in a footwell dare to express their discontent, and obviously it requires being domestically abused that way. So at this point, Waterson actually pushes the button in his car to move the electrical operated seats further back. So bear in mind, we've got an exhausted kid who's been falling over and dragged along, and now we have one of his caregivers, the boyfriend of his mother, and the way he's responding to this situation is to actually care about his own legs. So he stretches his legs all the way right out and pushes it back to take up more space in Alfie's situation. So Alfie's footwell is really small now. And to give you some idea of what I'm talking about, the maximum space in the footwell where Alfie actually was just about 30 centimetres. So imagine a standard ruler. Small, right? And imagining a 3-year-old child in that space is terrifying, isn't it? 30 centimetres. Literally, imagine that, being shoved down there in that space. I mean, that would make you claustrophobic per se. But this could actually be reduced to 9.5 centimetres at the press of a button. 9.5 centimetres. That's how small that space could be made. Alfie was basically trapped in this tiny space that would be terrifying. And he's 3. He hasn't got the physical wherewithal to do anything to prevent what's happening. He is like a caged animal. He can't do anything about it. So what does he do? He does the one thing that every child is bestowed the capacity to do, to scream. And he's screaming and he's asking for more room. And the way he's responding to that, because he's desperate, is he's kicking the back of the seat. And he's asking Waterson to move forward because he's scared. So he calls out Mummy, and he's constantly letting people know that he's really worried about this. He's not enjoying this. It's scary for him. And this would be because physically he was feeling very oppressed. Now, we don't know what Hoare's response was. We don't actually know exactly what was said. But according to Hoare, and the reason I'm saying that is because this is anecdotal, it's from this particular individual who had a vested interest in telling the story, how they told the story, and she certainly is going to be wanting to protect herself when telling this story. But nonetheless, I will bring in what she said. According to Hoare, she did realise that Alfie was having trouble breathing. Really? Was that when he was screaming out that he was having problems breathing and kicking the seat desperately to try to get attention so somebody would do something about it? But in the spite of this, she does actually say to Waterson, can he move his seat forward again? Because obviously her son is struggling. In response to that, Waterson does move his seat forward. But then he complains that he doesn't have enough room for his legs. And of course, Waterson, being the most important person in the entire universe, seems to think that his leg room is more important than a child's lung capacity to get air into them. So he's completely angry. He's very ambivalent to the child's distress. And what does he do? Well, his response to move the seat forward is to just shout at Alfie and to tell him to shut up. And basically he scares him. Now, again, think about what the child is going through. They have no control in this situation. All they have is the way it feels. All they have is the knowledge that this is something that's scaring them. And for their trouble, for their expression of that pain, they're actually getting shouted at. So closing down the child's capacity to even say, I am struggling. And this is a 3-year-old child. It blows my mind that I'm having to even talk about this case, much like other cases. But it blows my mind that we're literally talking about a little child who's been on this earth for like 36 months. They have no ability to defend themselves. And this grown-ass bully of a man isn't just physically harming this little boy, he's chastising him for daring to ask for his needs to be met. What does that tell you about his character? Now, you won't be surprised to find out that Alfie doesn't stop making noise because he's in a mess, he's in a state, he's scared, he's expressing that. And so, in spite of the fact that clearly this child is still struggling, Waterson then states words along the lines of these. I'm not being told what to do by a 3-year-old. Well, number one, it wasn't the 3-year-old who told you what to do, it was the 3-year-old's mother who was letting you know that the child was struggling. But also, what kind of an adult are you that you're feeling controlled by a 3-year-old? That's ridiculous, suggesting that you're the victim somehow because this 3-year-old is being so dominant and asking for airways to be clear, because that's what we're talking about right now. So he's feeling so angry that he's actually moved his seat forward so that the child can breathe. And he's obviously ruminating on that. And because the child isn't being instantly quiet and doing what he commands, he's gonna punish him. So he does. He pushes that button and he moves that seat back all the way back into Alfie. Think about that. Just over 9 centimetres space. And that's what he does. And this is in spite of knowing that that little boy is struggling to breathe. And it's reported in that car that Alfie was making choking sounds. And in spite of the fact that he was making choking sounds, he kept that seat in that position, fully reversed, all the way back to where they needed to go, in spite of all of that noise. Alfie was screaming, he was in clear distress. And in spite of that, his mother reported that she didn't think he was in danger. She just thought he was getting himself worked up. And her response was that she told him to shut up. So he did. But not for the reasons that she wanted him to shut up. Alfie was literally crushed by 12 stone of weight in the tiny 9.5 centimetre gap. This child was just over 3 foot tall. He weighed only 2.5 stone. This crime played out when he was trapped helplessly at his mother, the person who was meant to protect him more than anyone else in the world. He's trapped at her feet. And this is probably the most ironic statement that I heard from Waterson whilst doing this research. He later claimed that he hadn't moved his seat back into Alfie in anger. No, he said he'd just done it to get comfortable. Now, obviously I wasn't there, so I obviously have to accept that this is his perspective on it. I may not have been there, but it doesn't mean I can't have an opinion on it, does it? Because it doesn't make sense to me. It does not make sense to me that you would ignore the distressed screams of a child just to get comfortable. And how narcissistic would you have to be to do that? To actually think, you know what, Me having a bit more leg room is just a little bit more important than a child maybe being allowed to breathe. How do you believe that you are so important? So I don't care that he says he didn't do it in anger. It doesn't make sense to me. I fully believe he did, hence why he said that he wasn't going to be controlled by a child. And secondly, to not feel provoked in some way to soothe the screams of a child struggling is beyond me. If he didn't get angry, then what does that make him? Because you can almost say, okay, this is a terrible thing that he did, but to feel anger and then to respond to that anger is something that many of us will do. And we do regrettable things when we are angry. I have done regrettable things when I'm angry. That is something that you learn from, right? But to be cool, calm, and calculating, and to not feel anger, and to just think about your needs in spite of causing harm and pain to a child, well, that kind of makes you very cold-blooded, doesn't it? One could say that makes you quite a dangerous human if you were devoid of emotion when you were making those choices. Ignoring those cries because you're angry and you don't care if you're hurting the child actually is more plausible, isn't it? Because otherwise, like I said, means he was absolutely fully aware that Alfie was in the footwell when he moved his seat back, meaning that he was fully culpable for the ramifications of what happened. So his own argument actually makes him seem a lot more cold, a lot more calculating, and downright dangerous in comparison to somebody who reacts out of anger. Now, as I've said, there were 2 other passengers in the car, and passenger Emily Williams, she actually later described Alfie's confined position to court, and she said this: his feet were under the chair and he was putting his head back. He didn't have room for anything. On the journey back in that car, Alfie apparently went ominously quiet, quote. And you know what his mum thought? She thought he'd gone to sleep. I mean, think about that. She thought he'd gone to sleep. Is it just me, who when my child suddenly goes quiet and they've been whimpering and crying and struggling and making choking sounds, that I would maybe just test what was happening with them? I mean, let's be honest, for most of us, if not all of us, obviously not everyone will have children watching this, but I would imagine pretty much the maximum amount of people watching this would, in a situation where their child was showing any distress, would be so fixed on the child that should anything happen, like they go ominously quiet, they would be reacting immediately with fear. But again, she was probably just too busy on a mobile phone. So she said that he had just gone to sleep, and then before arriving back, obviously this ominous quietness gets to be a little bit concerning for Waterson. So he actually ends up shaking Alfie and he's telling him to wake up, getting no response. Picks him up, repeatedly tells him to wake up, then he starts shaking him a little. By the time they get back to Waterson's flat in Adams Way, Croydon, it's clear to all of them that Alfie has been seriously injured, and I mean seriously injured. He'd gone really floppy. I sigh because, again, what I'm going to tell you just demonstrates to me an absolute lack of capacity as a parent, and actually a lack of capacity as a human being, because it's not natural what they do, because initially they think he's just playing and mucking around. Why? Why would a 3-year-old child know how to manipulate a situation where he wants to evoke fear from his caregivers, so he pretends that he's just floppy and completely unconscious? That's not what a 3-year-old does. It's calculating. That's the kind of behaviour that a child may do if they want to manipulate a situation as they get older, because they understand the impact that fear can have on their primary caregivers, and to get attention, it's a way to do it. It's very rare, but you can see that kids will do that. But this is a 3-year-old. This is way beyond their thought capacity. It's even at a point where children of that age struggle to lie. Yeah, studies show children of 3 struggle to lie. Children of 5, they're pretty good at it. They've learned, lie, control the world a little bit. I didn't eat the chocolate cake with chocolate all around my mouth. At the end of the day, we can see that. Research tells it us, but at 3, nah. Innocent, naive. He's not playing at all. And I'll tell you why he's not playing, because he'd actually collapsed at this point and he'd stopped breathing. When Waterson removed Alfie from the car, he was already really pale. He was really unresponsive, and it's at this point that his mother says, "What have you done?" Immediately shifting any blame from her onto Waterson. "What have you done? What have you done? What have you done, mother? Having your child in the footwell, allowing them to have their airways cut off. What have you done?" But this demonstrates the kind of human beings we're dealing with right now. Waterson calls the paramedics at 7:23 p.m. and initially he starts CPR, but then he stops and he gives the phone to Lamb, and then Lamb starts to follow the CPR instructions from the emergency call handler, and that was something that Lamb had never done. It's something most of us will never do. Apparently at this point, Waterson cries out, "What have I done?" That will be very much a response, meaning, "Oh God, what have I done that will now affect me?" Not "what have I done? I've killed a child." Believe me, this will all be self-centered. It will be, "Oh my God, what have I done to my life? Right, I've really screwed up now, haven't I? Because I've got a dead kid on my hands and I've been involved in that death." And he actually walks away from the scene at this point. Not normal behaviour, is it? If you are responsible for causing death and injury to a child, and you've got an opportunity to show the world that you are desperately trying to revive that child because you didn't want to do that thing, then you're going to be the person doing CPR. But no, he's too concerned with his own feelings. Apparently he just walks into his flat and bursts into tears for himself. Now, this is where it's all going to get you really mad. Because if we do something terrible, what separates us from being a heinous monster and a genuine human being who's made a horrible error of judgment, even if it seems heinous, that error of judgment, is being willing to be accountable for your actions, right? If all you care about in that moment of the most gross negligence you're hopefully ever going to be involved in, and in that situation you then try to cover your own tracks and make it look like you've had nothing to do with it, that says you do not have a shred of empathy running through your body. And you're certainly not a person who's going to learn from your mistakes. You're not going to be somebody who's ever going to truly understand being fully accountable. So how does Waterson deal with this situation? Well, he basically denies that he's ever been on the shopping trip with Alfie. So when he gets questioned by the police, he basically denies it all completely. We'll talk about that a little bit more later on. But meanwhile, we've got Lamb, who is clearly trying to save Alfie. He's doing CPR on Alfie. And when the paramedics arrive, they then take over and they are desperate. They really are to save Alfie. They are constantly working on him. And as soon as the paramedics arrive, they get a real sense that there's something more to this case, because it feels like every single one of the adults who is around Alfie is just lying. And it's where the case essentially begins. This is where it starts to play out and unfold. So his mother, nor anyone else who are at the scene, tells paramedics that he's been travelling in the footwell. None of them. No one says, "Oh well, you know what might have happened? He may have had his airways cut off because we had him in the footwell of the car, and I know that's not legal and it's highly regrettable, but this seems to be how the injuries will have occurred." But they don't do that. And please bear in mind, when the paramedics are there, they need to get as much information about what has happened, because there could be a shortcut to treating the person. If you withhold information that could lead to that individual having a positive outcome, then you are complicit in them being injured or worse. It's as simple as that. But they're not giving this information over. But the paramedics aren't convinced with the story that's being told by Hoare, and they call the police because this seems like a very unusual set of circumstances. Now, when the police arrive, Hoare is actually on the phone to Waterson. The police say that the reason that they were talking to each other on the phone was for one simple reason. They were trying to get their stories straight. They wanted to make sure that those stories aligned. So Hoare tells the police that they'd got the taxi home and claims that Alfie had basically become unresponsive after falling asleep in the taxi. Bit bit of a problem. Hoare's thought about the story to tell the police, but hasn't maybe thought about the intricate details, such as who the taxi service were, or even the kind of car that they were transported in. So she basically tells the police and emergency responders that Alfie had been in this magical taxi that she can neither describe nor confirm was arranged through, and that this magical taxi also had a child seat, so clearly trying to suggest that everything was above board and legal. Would you be thinking of this when your child isn't breathing? Would you be concocting a story to protect yourself when your child is potentially dead? Would you even have the ability to create such a spectacular thread of lies when you're dealing with the possible death of your baby boy? Because that's what these guys are doing. In the immediate throes and panic that should be falling out from this set of circumstances, they are crafting and calculating an opportunity to prevent themselves getting into trouble. That's how important Alfie is to them. That all they're thinking about is how to protect themselves. Like for most of us, if our child was dead by accident, we would be totally helpless, desperately taking responsibility for it. How have I done this? What have I done to cause this? Even innocent parents will do that because you feel so responsible for that child. Not in this case. They're just figuring out how they can cover up their own arses. It's as simple as that. So Hoare is basically telling the police that she's got no idea whatsoever how these injuries could potentially have been caused. Now, I will tell you that it turns out by the time the emergency responders got there and they worked on Alfie, there was literally nothing that could have been done. There really wasn't. He was already catastrophically impacted on. But remember, at the point where Alfie is being worked on, his mum doesn't realise that he's going to die. For all she knows, she's withholding vital information that could absolutely have saved him. And she did that willingly. She was more concerned about a cover story. Now, like I said, the police are working with the paramedics to try to figure out what's happened. And the paramedics are still working on Alfie when the police arrive. And it's obvious to both the police and the paramedics that Alfie's been dead for some time. And it turns out he'd had a cardiac arrest. He gets rushed, in spite of this, to St Thomas's Hospital in South London because they still want to make sure they give him every chance. And even though it doesn't go well, and they are clearly aware that this child has had some horrible situation play out for him to arrive in this position, they do keep him on life support for a few days. And it's during this time that they're basically establishing what has happened to him. And when they look at Alfie's injuries, they actually compare it to those normally sustained by a car crash. So that's how impactful the pressure has been on Alfie. And one of the really reprehensible things to add to this case regarding the apparent caregivers is that whilst Alfie is on life support at that hospital, his mother texts Waterson, this is at 8:07 p.m. the first evening, and says, "They know we are lying." Yeah, of course they know you're lying because you aren't clever and you can't manipulate reality, and you certainly can't manipulate the level of injury that that child sustained in your care. So of course they knew you were lying. It's a tragic case this because the doctors are unable to revive Alfie. And I just want you to think about how easily preventable this crime was, because that's what we're going to talk about soon. The reality of how did this crime happen? It was so easy to prevent it. We should not be talking about Alfie this way. We shouldn't be talking about his life support being switched off 3 days later on the 4th of February 2018. We shouldn't be talking about the fact that a 3-year-old little boy met his end this way, because it was so preventable. When the paediatric pathologist looked at his death to confirm his death, he said it was completely unnatural. And it appeared to have been caused by an increase in pressure. As we know, we understand where the pressure came from. And it was noted that Alfie had also been a previously healthy boy. So there was literally no natural explanation for his death. Ultimately, Alfie died from compression asphyxia, so a deprivation of blood or oxygen caused ischemic brain injury, which obviously we will know was a situation where he was having his oxygen cut off by the fact that he couldn't literally breathe. It was such a small space. And basically he had a catastrophic brain injury. The autopsy later found as well external petechial hemorrhages. So they're like tiny red spots that are caused by ruptured veins. And he found those on Alfie's head and body and also inside his chest cavity. So this internal bleeding was caused by the impact to the right side of his body, i.e. from the car seat pressing into him. Like, I suppose to put it in a really simple way, he was basically squashed by the car seat and suffocated. It's probably the easiest way of describing it. 2 car child seats would actually later be found in Waterson's flat. So they had access to the car seats. And if they had been used, I would not be talking about this tragedy. This tragedy would have been avoided. And even though it's completely illegal to travel with children on your lap, because obviously if you crash your car, the child can be seriously injured, as the child can also seriously injure you if they go into you, as far as the impact of a child going over the front seat into the passenger or driver's seat. You know, equally, you can all get very badly injured. But even so, if you had had that child on your lap, the chances are that if you'd got home safely, there'd have been no injury. It's the fact that they've shoved these little people into the footwell and basically made it so uncomfortable and difficult for them that it's led to the death of a child. So it could have been avoided. And this is what makes this so challenging, because we are talking about this brutal end to a child's life that literally a tiny bit of care and compassion could have prevented. Either using car seats, making sure that he had space in that footwell, which I find reprehensible, putting a child in a footwell, but making sure there was space, or having you on the lap. Like I said, you shouldn't do either of those that are illegal, but it would still have resulted in a different outcome. From the outset, these adults who were meant to be providing care for this kid just lied through their teeth. And those lies were orchestrated by Waterson. Remember what I said about him, the dark triad? Remember what I said about him being a bully? This is how he manages situations. He controls them. And he orchestrated this complete perversion of justice, this lying to the police, through threats and intimidation. Through threats, intimidations, and a web of lies. And from the get-go, all he's trying to do is to deflect blame from himself and to throw the police off the scent. So he forces others to lie on his behalf. All he is thinking about is his own needs, not of the innocent child whose life he's snuffed out. And these lies, they were problematic. They seriously hindered the investigation. They wasted lots of police time. And they also delayed the investigation by several weeks. Now, I don't feel any empathy with anybody involved in this case because they had the answers right at the beginning. They could have acknowledged what had happened. I appreciate that Hoare believed that she was desperately in love with Waterson. She wanted to protect him, but I cannot understand why. What makes a woman feel that a partner is more important than a child is something I can't comprehend and I do not compute. But even if you, in your everyday life with your partner, make choices that I don't think are good for your child to see and that they feel that you choose your partner over them more than you choose them. We're talking about a whole different situation here. We're talking about a woman who has lost her child that she should have unconditionally protected and loved. And in spite of knowing who caused the death of that child, she's still choosing Waterson over Alfie. So she wants to protect him. He's caused the death of her child, and she is less concerned about that than she is about retaining the relationship and protecting her partner. She did later on say that the reason that she was lying was because she was scared of Waterson. You know why I'm not going to buy that? I'm not going to buy it because if you just told the police the truth about what happened, then Waterson would have been in prison, right? If you really want to get somebody out of your life, that's a perfect opportunity, isn't it? To say to the police, my partner caused the death of my child. Job done. The fact that she's orchestrating and colluding in these lies says to me that she was quite happy to keep on in this relationship with Waterson. in spite of what he did. So she involves herself in corroborating his lies, suggests that he hadn't even been with Alfie when he was fatally injured. And Waterson even lies in a message to his mother, to his own mother, and says, I got a call saying Alfie wasn't well. Apparently they was in Croydon, not nowhere. So trying to create these backstories to this absolute lie. On the 3rd of February 2018, this is whilst Alfie was still on life support, Hoare texted Waterson this: I love you. No one can be blamed. Well, actually they can, Waterson replied. I know. Make sure you delete these messages. Blood boiling. This story isn't working that effectively, so then the group decide, well, they need to change this false narrative. So they decide that the best way to do this is to say that actually they hadn't been in the taxi. Instead, they say they'd visited Hoare's friend Jess and had travelled in a white VW Golf car driven by an Aaron Foster. Bear in mind, we're also noting that Waterson at this point continues to deny that he was with them at any stage. So they've now got this new story. And red rag to a bull as far as the police are concerned in these situations. You start changing your story when a child has died, they are going to home in their investigations, recognising that the only reason that you are lying is because you have something to hide. We do not lie by mistake, we lie by design. Police are getting CCTV footage, and they managed to get it, of Hoare, Waterson, Lamb and Williams in the Audi. Bang to rights. When later asked why he had lied, Waterson then says to the police that he didn't want his parents to know that there were others living at his flat, because apparently they had helped him with a deposit. So he felt that it was probably better, to pervert the course of justice and to deflect a scenario where a child had died and the investigation around it, just in case his parents were a little bit upset about the deposit on the flat that they'd helped him with. Oh, yeah, that makes sense. I imagine that your parents would be really angry about the deposit on a flat that you're allowing other people to share with you. I mean, it seems like they wouldn't be concerned at all about your involvement in the death of a child and you lying about it and then using them to justify the reasons behind it. I'm sure that'll have gone down far better, won't it? Nothing like a clever criminal, right? Also, be aware that Waterson actually gave the police a false name. Apparently he panicked, so he just couldn't remember his own name and gave them a false name, because that isn't going to instantly get you seen as somebody trying to hide something and again cause a huge amount of problem within the investigation. If you have nothing to hide, you hide nothing, simple as. And during the police interview, he would also frequently drop in the name of his adoptive father, former MP and lawyer. It's so grating when people do that. And I'll tell you why it grates on me. Because on one level you're like, well, that's not going to do anything, because at the end of the day, the police don't really care about whether his father, adoptive or otherwise, is an MP or a lawyer. But you will also be unsurprised if you look at cases that are tried in the courts. People who are related to certain individuals, it does have an impact. You should look up some cases where paedophiles have had huge collections of paedophilia material, as in child molestation virtually through cyber material, and they happen to have gone to a very posh school and know very posh people, and their sentences in comparison to people who have done far less are tiny. There is a prejudice in our system, a bias in our system. And if you happen to have been born to the right people in the right postcode, then your sentences are often very different. I bring into view a case where a girl stabbed her boyfriend but was training to be a doctor, and the judge just didn't go hard on her because she was going to be a great asset to society. she stabbed her boyfriend. I mean, she could have killed him, but you're all like, oh, well, she wants to be a doctor. Well, I mean, I suppose she probably is pretty handy with a scalpel, if nothing else. But right postcode, right parents can make a difference. And he's playing on this. And Waterson was later accused, actually, of trying to use his parents to make him untouchable. The police described Waterson as arrogant, selfish, and deeply unpleasant throughout the investigation. Bring you back to what I said earlier on. Dark triad, Machiavellian traits, psychopathic traits, narcissistic, right? He's certainly living up to that, isn't he? Without a doubt. And obviously the police would be absolutely enraged by this because they hate dealing with child death per se. It's the worst part of their job. Emily Williams, that was the other backstreet passenger, she ends up getting threatened by Waterson in mid-February 2018. And he says to her, you keep quiet about what happened. And if you don't keep quiet, well, I can make people disappear. And he suggested to her that if she said anything that he was unhappy with, well, her daughter may grow up without a mother. He's horrible, isn't he? He also got access to her Facebook account. And this is the reason why she ended up giving 3 false accounts to the police about what happened in the car. She would later tell the court this. He was telling me a lot of things. He said he'd put me in the boot of the car and get rid of me. He said he'd kill me. She was also assaulted by Alfie's mother. On the 14th of February 2018, this is almost 2 weeks after Alfie's death, Hoare slapped her across the face, hard enough to leave a handprint that remained there for half an hour. She also told her to continue lying for Waterson. So I'm sorry, I'm not buying in to the fact that Hoare believed that Waterson was somebody that she was under threat of. She is fully engaged in this. She's being violent too. She's intimidating witnesses too. And she also texted her a few days later saying she was lucky she didn't hit her harder. Oh, Hoare sounds like a nice person, doesn't she? Williams would later state that Hoare was 100% complicit in the cover-up and that she was going along with it and she was helping. And she was, wasn't she? However, Hoare eventually told her half-sister, Ashley Jeffrey, what had really happened. And you actually see this with people who aren't, shall we say, psychopaths. They do have conscience. It doesn't matter how reprehensible they are, what an inhumane human they are, how disgusting their behaviour is, how regrettable the outcome of those behaviours are. You have a conscience. And you know what? That conscience expands and grows and it beats you up and it makes you feel unmanageable feelings and you just have to let people know. It's too big for you to carry. And we see this with people who aren't traditional psychopaths, that they do this awful thing and it's just keeping it in is so difficult, it eats them up, and that's what happens. And Ashley Jeffrey is a decent human being. She really is. She's a half-sister, but she knows what is right and she persuades her to tell the police the truth. And I think that Ashley Jeffrey is a really important person here because the police are struggling. There are so many lines of inquiry. It's confusing. All they want to do is get justice for this little boy. And this constant retracting and reclaiming situations and creating new circumstances that they just are confused by is causing them a whole heap of problem within the inquiry. Ashley Jeffrey taking that stand and saying you need to tell the truth, that helps the investigation thoroughly. Of course it does. So on the 15th of February, she confesses exactly what's happened. This is 2 weeks after Alfie has been fatally injured. She discloses that Waterson had indeed been in the vehicle, and Marcus Lamb at this point then provides police with the registration number of Waterson's Audi. Why is it needed? Well, because Waterson, if it isn't bad enough, is lying about all of these things that make him seem like he's not involved, has also decided that the way to throw off the police's scent is to sell his Audi. So he'd sold his Audi for about £800. He wanted to get rid of it so that he got rid of the evidence. And after selling it, he actually tried to get the buyer, Mr. Jules, to say he'd actually purchased the vehicle off Mr. Lamb. Megalomaniac? We're talking megalomaniac, aren't we? That he's trying to even control people who've simply purchased a car. Hello, you've taken my Audi at £800. I feel it was a bargain. Now, there was a little bit of an extra clause to said sale of said vehicle. All I'm going to need you to do is to perjure yourself, ideally, and just lie and say that I didn't sell you the car. I just want to buy the car. I know, but it's a real bargain, isn't it? It's a great car. You just need to agree to this little clause. I'm not really okay. Agree to the clause! I can imagine it went something like that. So he doesn't want the police to trace the car back to him. Subsequently, of course, when the police did trace the car back to Waterson, what did he do? He was like, totally, bang to rights, should have told you this in the beginning, absolutely my car, should just have owned it, and now I am admitting that I am said keeper of said car. Didn't happen. The way that Waterson dealt with the police, very clearly finding it quite easy to get back to the fact that he was the person who owned it, he decides that still, somehow, it isn't the police just doing what they do, and actually it must have been his apparent friend stroke person he knows, Lamb. So he decides that the way he's going to manage this situation is to attack and threaten Lamb. He's basically like, the police aren't clever enough to have outwitted me. It must be you who's grassed me up. And of course we know, snitches and get stitches. I don't agree with that. I think most of the time, snitches get lighter sentences and snitches don't get sent to prison. Just putting it out there, in my experience, but grassing up isn't allowed. Waterson isn't happy with it. So he and a friend, Gary, they beat up Lamb in Crystal Palace Park, South London, on the 18th of February 2018. And like I said, Waterson is your classic heavyweight egomaniac bully. So it's not enough that he's beaten Lamb up. He further humiliates him by filming the assault on his phone. He holds his head to the ground and he demands to know what he's told the police. So he just wants everybody to know that as far as he's concerned, Lamb has let him down and is now the lowest of the low. He's a grass. Just going to throw it in there, Waterson. I think you'll find the lowest of the low is a child killer. Putting it out there. That's why I'm doing this video on you. I'm doing this video on you so that anyone who comes across you in the rest of your life knows that a grass is somebody that most of us would have around for a cuppa at the end of the day. They're just telling the truth. But a child killer, well, it's a whole different category, isn't it? A child killer. And hopefully people will share this story on their mobile phones and remember your face, just like I'll remember your face. I digress, my lovelies, I digress. Waterson then gets arrested, of course he does, it was always going to happen, and he's charged with witness intimidation of Marcus Lamb, rightfully so. Despite the fact that the police actually have video evidence of the assault, Waterson pleads not guilty. Not guilty. We've got it on video. It's not me. It's literally you. It's literally you. You've shared it. It's you. Talking about the crime that you've done. No, it isn't. Why did they do it? I mean, genuinely, why did they do it? Probably thought his adoptive dad was going to be able to get him off. But nonetheless, he pleads not guilty. At this point, he's also charged with conspiring to pervert the course of justice, which we all understand why. All of those lies that have been told about the fact that he wasn't there, and also the lies that have been told that have made investigating Alfie's death very difficult. And finally, he's charged with Alfie's manslaughter, specifically unlawful act manslaughter. Now, this is where someone causes the death of another through an unlawful criminal act. Good example of that would be somebody who punches somebody and they hit the head and then they die. Now this is different to murder because in murder you have to prove that there's an intention to kill or at least to cause really serious harm. Unlawful act manslaughter just requires proof of the mental element of the unlawful act that caused death. So in Waterson's case, the authorities aimed to prove the unlawful act was Waterson purposefully crushing Alfie with the car seat in anger. He also pleads not guilty to this. Just not guilty. Don't know what you're on about. Wasn't even there. Now, Hoare is also charged, rightfully so. She's charged with manslaughter, child cruelty, and conspiring to pervert the course of justice. And she also gets charged with common assault on Emily Williams, as she should be. Now, prior to the trial, Hoare and Williams plead guilty to conspiring to pervert the course of justice by making false statements to the police, which is obvious because that's exactly what they did. So they had to go guilty on those, simple as. We all know you get much harsher sentences when you go not guilty, and it's bang to rights that you absolutely do it. It's there, everybody can see. It's in the notes from the police, you lied. And also they've got this kind of intricate web where they've concocted stories and they've intimidated witnesses, so they had to do that. Now, during the trial at the Old Bailey in 2019, the prosecution argued that Alfie's death had been no accident, and they described Waterson's actions. They said the deliberate movement of the seat by electrical operation by the touch of a button and involving the application of considerable force to Alfie took place not once but twice. And he basically says that he hadn't known anything was wrong until he got home. Only then did he realise that there was a problem. He claimed that he'd only moved the seat back like 1 inch. And as far as he was concerned, Alfie was fine. Then he moved it forward again. And essentially, there wasn't a problem. During the cross-examination, the prosecution said this: "On your account, Waterson, it could not have been the seat that caused his death, and you have been horribly framed for Alfie's death." Waterson claimed that was correct. Yeah, that's exactly right. That sounds perfect. That sounds like a great description of exactly what played out. I have no idea and I'm completely innocent and I've been framed in all this. So then he's asked, okay, how did Alfie die then? And he responded this: "That's what I want to find out as well." So many things to say. Too many expletives involved to air. But there you go, the arrogance. Oh my God, I'm just this innocent victim, and here I am in front of this court, and I'm really only here to also find out what happened to this poor little boy. And he starts saying, you know what, his mum was shouting at him. He was in the car, she was screaming at him. Also, she told him on the night of Alfie's death that she blamed herself. Yeah, that's true, because she's to blame, as are you, but at least she shows a thread of remorse in the fact that she realises that she is culpable for this. That actually makes her more human than Waterson, doesn't it? When he's asked, do you feel any responsibility for the child's death? This is what he said: "Should have said something and not put the children in the car in the footwell." That's his limit. The only thing that he did that was wrong was that he kept quiet and allowed the kids to be in the footwell. So when he's then asked, understandably, by the prosecution why he'd lied to authorities about what had happened, he said he just went along with it. Just went along with the fictitious story that was given to the police by Hoare. It's all Hoare. I mean, excuse me, isn't it you who's saying that people who grass people up are like the scourge of the earth and need beating up and publicly shaming? That's what you did to Lamb. And yet here we are in a court of law where you're trying to blame everything on your apparent partner. I mean, it's just telling, isn't it? One rule for one, another for another. Our society's been full of that recently, hasn't it? One rule for us, one rule for them. Really frustrates me. Linear. Everything should be linear. So the prosecution argue, understandably, that Hoare had a duty of care to Alfie, but rightfully so, she did nothing to help him when he was crushed at her feet. That's true, isn't it? So Hoare claims the reason that that was the case is because I was scared of my partner Waterson. She said that he'd often get annoyed or he'd get angry And she said, you never know how he was going to react to things. I don't doubt that. I'm sure he did get angry. He's a horrible bully. But she's been massively involved in concocting stories and also intimidating witnesses, so I'm not buying into this. She also confirmed that he had in the past got annoyed with Alfie and said that he made her feel quite little when he bragged about how important his family was. All of this is just extraneous noise, isn't it? At the end of the day, how does that result in your kid dying the way that he died? You reprehensibly neglected him. You both did. That's why I'm talking about this story right now. And you are equally guilty as far as I'm concerned. Now, a year before Alfie's death, she'd actually called the police during an argument with Waterson, and she was pregnant at the time, and she'd confronted him about whether he was actually seeing someone else. At this point, he'd apparently thrown into a rage, ordered her into a car, and she actually told the court he started driving stupidly and he was shouting at me that he didn't care if he killed us in the car. Hoare also claimed that he threatened to drive into a wall saying, I'll kill myself, you and that baby. However, whilst Hoare claimed that she was threatened and she felt worried about his reaction and that therefore she had lied for him, she'd also threatened Emily Williams in order to make her lie. That's not great for her case, is it? She certainly doesn't sound like a slinking wallflower who's terrified of the world. You know, she's a bully too. She's a thug too. Now, Waterson, meanwhile, claims that actually what she said isn't true. He never got angry with Alfie. Never. He would never hurt a child. He told the court that Alfie's mother had slapped and told off her son during the car journey, and he believed that this was because Alfie was pinching her. Now, his defence team claimed that Waterson lied, not because he knew he purposefully moved the seat back and killed Alfie, but because he was trying to protect himself and the other adults in the car because they had not used child car seats. Yeah. I mean, that makes sense. It makes perfect sense. I mean, the big problem we've got in this situation is definitely the fact that you didn't use a car seat. I mean, that's like £100 fine and some points on your licence. I mean, that's the big thing, isn't it? The dead child in the footwell of the seat because you suffocated him and crushed him. That's no big deal. Let's just worry about the really important stuff, the legal situation with the car seats. I understand why the defence did that, because they want to minimise how it played out and give reason and licence for why Waterson concocted this unbelievable story that was all about saving his own arse per se. Now, I said I was incandescent at the beginning of this, and I am, and I will be whenever I think about this case, because ultimately the jury cleared Hoare of manslaughter. They found her guilty of child cruelty. I have no idea how. I just imagine that the defence team somehow managed to make her look like a victim. The jury were unable to reach a verdict in relation also to Waterson's unlawful act manslaughter charge. Because of this, there had to be a retrial. I know, guys, I don't understand it either. On the first day of the retrial, he's obviously got wise to what needs to happen, so he pleads guilty to gross negligence manslaughter. So rather than an unlawful act causing death, this is where the defendant owed victim a duty of care. So basically, they owed the victim a duty of care and they failed to provide that care to a point where that individual dies. In Waterson's case, he owed a duty of care to Alfie on account of the parent-child relationship, and he clearly breached that duty of care because he placed Alfie in the footwell, and also he failed to notice that Alfie was being crushed to death. Now, negligence is actually usually dealt with by civil law, so like a road traffic accident claim where you sue the negligent driver who caused you your injury. However, when an act or omission, which is like a failure to act, by the defendant is very seriously, i.e. grossly negligent, it becomes a criminal offence. So as in this case, Waterson was negligent in the act of pushing the chair back and not noticing the distress of the child. So he was negligent in causing Alfie's death. And he's also found guilty of conspiring to pervert the course of justice. and also witness intimidation in relation to Marcus Lamb. Now, I think that he went guilty on that lesser claim of manslaughter because the jury not being able to come to a decision made him think, wow, the next trial I might get unlucky and get found guilty and there's a very long sentence that could potentially ensue. So I think it's a very calculated reasoning behind going guilty at this point to a lesser circumstance, so to speak. I'm angry about this case, I'm not going to lie. I'm really angry. The sentencing took place on the 30th of May 2019. Judge Mr. Justice Timothy Kerr sentenced Hoare at the Old Bailey. She stated that she put Alfie in danger by allowing him to travel in the footwell of the car, and she failed to protect him when the passenger seat was moved back. And her indifference to child safety was an aggravating factor, but there were mitigating factors that were brought in. Hoare had previous good character. What, apart from intimidating people and slapping them? Is it just me? Is that just me? A previous good character? How do you know about a previous good character? The likelihood is she's been a horrible cow elsewhere and it's just not been criminalised. Certainly her actions around the death of her own son and the intimidation of said witnesses does not speak to a good character as a mitigating factor. But nonetheless, apparently she had a good character. She had a difficult life. Sorry, that isn't an excuse as far as I'm concerned. Nonetheless, apparently she grew up in a chaotic household with separated parents and an environment of drug and alcohol abuse. Not sure how that gives her a license or an excuse to kill a kid, but okay. The judge also took into account that she had lost her son and would have to live with that guilt. Really? She didn't give a shit about him. She literally let him scream and choke and die at her feet. And then she was more concerned about covering her own back and that of her partner's and beating up somebody who might have told the truth. Can somebody indicate where the guilt is? If anybody knows her or can get to her and have that conversation, can you express where the guilt is? Maybe if you're watching because you've seen your name on this, where is your guilt? I don't see it. I don't see guilt. Anyway, the judge came to a conclusion that Hoare needed to be sentenced for a total of 2 years and 9 months. 2 years and 9 months. That's less years than Alfie had on this earth. Her own mother would later actually say that as far as she was concerned, her daughter should spend the rest of her life in jail. And while she would stand by her, she would never forgive her. As testament to her mother with respect. Don't care how chaotic the lifestyle was that she was brought up in, at least her mum's got a shred of conscience and understands that Alfie deserved more. And even though she said she'll forgive her in one way that means that she can still have her in her life, she will not forgive her for the crime. But ultimately, a parent's love tends to be unconditional, and it's what a shame that her own daughter doesn't understand what that is, because she did not unconditionally love her son. But I agree with her mother that that sentence is pathetic. Pathetic. And Hoare was actually released on parole in October 2019. She had served 5 months. 5 months. She let her son choke to death at her feet. And she served 5 months. She got recalled to prison because she actually breached her licence conditions, and that was because she failed to keep in contact with the probation service. Guilt? Does she feel guilt? I mean, you can't even maintain contact with the probation service. So she got taken back into custody in May 2020. She got released in July 2021, and that was when her sentence expired. Now, apparently she's gone home to her mum's, who looks after her. She's dyed her hair blonde, and she's just getting on with life. I hope she's eaten up every second of every day, ad infinitum, for the rest of her life. I hope he haunts her. I hope he haunts her. On the 14th of November 2019, Judge Kerr sentenced Waterson, described him as manipulative, dishonest, deceitful, controlling, threatening, and sometimes violent. Also said, I think he was very lucky to avoid unlawful act manslaughter conviction at the first trial. However, he did, and was instead sentenced for gross negligence manslaughter. And this is what the judge stated. I sentence you on the basis that you did not intend to harm Alfie. I do not find that you were annoyed with Alfie and moved your car seat back because of that annoyance, albeit not in anger, but for your own comfort. You moved the car seat back twice and not only once. It's very unusual. I disagree with the judge, isn't it? I tend to really enjoy reading you what they think. I didn't enjoy reading that, because basically the suggestion is that he just didn't notice he was killing the kid. It wasn't that he was actually actively trying to harm that child, even though we all know you cannot crush a child quietly. The child lets you know. So I'm not convinced. The judge also concluded that the risk of death to Alfie as a result of Waterson's actions was considerable, but not very high. Not very high. Alfie died. How much higher can you get? And because of this, subsequently, the starting point of Waterson's sentence was lower than it would otherwise have been. So apparently, reversing your car seat so far back that you squashed a 3-year-old child into a 9.5 centimetre gap with a 12-stone weight for half an hour journey whilst they scream and gasp and choke before finally suffering cardiac arrest wasn't considered to expose Alfie to a very high risk of death. It makes you wonder, what is classed as a very high risk? The aggravating factor that was brought forward in the sentencing was Alfie's vulnerability, his very young age. Waterson also had 7 convictions for 13 offences, including 3 convictions for assault. That included, in August 2014, punching a man in the eye, kicking and beating a former girlfriend in October 2014. Furthermore, although Waterson apparently expressed remorse, it came very late. So late, one could suggest it was just being used in a calculating way to make people think that he felt bad about what he'd done. Remember that prior to this apparent admission of remorse, he'd denied any responsibility for Alfie's death. He'd made his family endure a trial, and even though Waterson apparently had a difficult childhood, we have to presume that this was before being adopted by his highly important parents, who of course now must be very proud. Sorry, I know it's not his parents' fault, but remember he tried to use them, name dropping, to get a lighter sentence, or at least put himself in a position where people would believe that, you know, he came from a really good family, so what harm could he really do? Now, this was all taken into consideration as a mitigating factor. So they did say to themselves, well, you know, the original childhood was problematic and therefore we need to acknowledge this. But I don't buy it. Like I said, as far as I'm concerned, this is a guy who shows absolutely no remorse whatsoever, and his character prior to this offence is clear by all those things I've just listed. Ultimately, he was sentenced to 5 years and 6 months for Alfie's manslaughter. He was also sentenced to 2 years for witness intimidation and 18 months for perverting the course of justice, all to run concurrently. He got a total of 7 years and 6 months for crushing a toddler to death. When Emily Williams was sentenced, she was actually heavily pregnant. She was given a 5-month suspended sentence for conspiring to pervert the course of justice. She was also made to complete 100 hours unpaid work. The judge described her as really easily led and that she was passive and she had very low self-esteem. I would come down in the same way on that girl. I think the fact that she didn't feel that she could tell the truth because she was getting intimidated is probably why initially she didn't. And I think that she felt highly bullied. That noted, she was still involved in the death of a child, but I have less of an issue with her actions than I do of the mother and the boyfriend to the mother. As far as I'm concerned, they are solely responsible for this death. In hindsight, there were 3 children in that car that fateful day. There was Alfie, Williams's child, and pathetic little Waterson, who wouldn't allow anybody to have car seats in his precious car because, you know, that would be a problem because then he wouldn't be able to shove as many people in there as he wanted. And remember, that childish little man, it was all about stretching his legs at the expense of Alfie's life, at the expense of Alfie being allowed to breathe. And then when Alfie was struggling with those breaths and making it clear that he was unhappy, what did he do? Well, he threw a temper tantrum and he basically further attacked Alfie and made it even more difficult for him because that's the kind of personality that man had. After the trial, Alfie's family released a statement and said, "As a family, we are utterly devastated about the death of Alfie. He was a very happy 3-year-old boy with his whole life ahead of him. The tragic circumstances surrounding his death are something we will never come to terms with. For the last 19 months, we have experienced a very traumatic police investigation and a court trial, with members of the family giving evidence to help secure the prosecution and fight for justice. No sentence will ever be enough. But today, we finally gave Alfie a voice and justice has prevailed. We welcome the court result and sentence and take comfort that the person who killed Alfie has been held responsible. We hope that we can move forward in private with our treasured memories of Alfie." I have to say, I think they were very lenient in that statement. I think that I would probably have been more bitter and felt that the judge had not given a sentence that was acceptable or appropriate. I think it's incredibly lenient, the sentencing. However, in spite of, as I said, what I consider a very considered and relatively empathic response in the statement that that family gave, they were not afforded a level of respect, as far as I'm concerned, by the authorities, because the final insult that happened to Alfie's family came this year, 2022. Waterson was released early from prison last month. So the time that he spent inside included time served whilst on remand. So he spent just 3 years in prison. And to make it worse, Alfie's family were not even informed of the early release. Apparently he made such good progress in prison. You know, he completed several courses, which clearly means that he's just an upstanding citizen now. So as far as I'm concerned, regardless of what the court and the prison system thinks of Waterson, the opinion of myself, but more importantly, the police who investigated this unforgivable crime is very clear. Scotland Yard's Detective Chief Inspector Simon Harding said this: "It's hard to imagine what sort of pain anyone would go through when you are being crushed in that way. For a 3.5-year-old boy to be crushed by something so strong and no one helping, it's a shocking way to die. Stephen Waterson has come across as selfish, abhorrent individual who killed a 3.5-year-old child and has never stood up and said what had happened, or never taken responsibility for the actions he performed on that day." And I think that the police are a far better group of people to forge that opinion, because they know what it's like to be at the scene of the death of a child and then to witness the lies and the fabric of deception, the threads that were created to distort the investigation to such a place in principle that they may not have been able to uncover what truly happened. It's they who dealt with those interviews and interrogations. It's they who saw Waterson dip and dive and try to provoke a scenario where he could blame other people. It's they that will have watched him in court pretending to be sorry for a crime that they know he was culpable for. So I think that the police opinion is the one that I will go with. Waterson is an abhorrent, reprehensible, egocentric human being who, as far as I am concerned, knowingly and willingly brought the death of a child about. We can't bring Alfie back. We can't do anything about the leniency of that sentence. But what we can all do is remember that Alfie deserves legacy, and to make a decision individually as to whether any of us would be willing to forgive Waterson, no matter what remorse he shows, or indeed Hoare, because they get to live their lives, don't they? Neither of them are old. They can have other children. They can go on to lead lives that Alfie will never have the opportunity to do so. I find the sentencing on this case bizarre, incorrect, and deeply upsetting. And I hope that wherever Alfie is now, that he's in a position where he is loved, cherished, and cared for, because this life didn't offer him such a place. I hope that you found this as anger-provoking as I have. I know life is all about forgiveness and lessons learned, but in this case, Alfie doesn't get to have any of that because he was killed. And all I can think of in this circumstance is a parent, a mother, an individual who is meant to provide security and sanctuary for her son, and the boyfriend of her who was meant to be given the gift of having an opportunity to spend time with a child that might not biologically have been his, but was his because she was giving him the opportunity to act in a father role, both allowed a little 3-year-old child to choke and suffocate at her feet, knowing that he was crushing that little boy, and they did nothing about it. And even when they realised they'd killed him, as opposed to owning it and making sure that the emergency services were fully aware of how his injuries had occurred, they just lied about it all. It's cold, isn't it, to end on that? Because I can't give you any sense of legacy or a belief that justice has really been served. But like I said at the very beginning, I was going to tell you the story from my position and my belief system, and I knew that it was going to leave you probably quite unhappy. And the most important thing that we do is always remember that what matters about this case is that we remember Alfie Lamb's name, a gorgeous little boy who deserves so much more from those people who were there to care for him. Take care. I see you soon. Remember, Wednesdays and Sundays always release content. It's been a tough one. I hope you've learned more about this case than you potentially knew before. I'd love to hear your comments. I like reading them. Give me a subscribe if you haven't done already. It really helps me. But also just that moment to remember that this is about Alfie Lamb, a life that never got to be fully lived, and one that most certainly deserved to be. Take care, guys.